Alright, so we're going to talk now about how you can use design to actually encourage your donors to give bigger gifts. It's these kind of subtle, secretive ways that we're going to use this lesson to pull back the curtain on. The other day, I was having lunch with a friend who's been doing design work for NGOs and companies in Southeast Asia, typically countries like Cambodia and Nepal, all throughout Southeast Asia. And now he's actually getting ready to move and go do work in Eastern Africa, doing the same type of thing, using design to help people be more impactful in these countries. So he was back in town, just long enough for us to carve a couple of hours out together so we could, just sit and catch up and really kind of just reconnect and think about things again. As just a side note, that's one of my favorite ways to spend any amount of time in life. But to be honest, we weren't talking about specifically designing for donations or designing for fundraising, right? What we were talking about was, on top of just life, we were talking about trends in design and how design, like anything else, can be susceptible to fads. And what we were talking about was the fact that he does this very particular type of design. It's heavily based on understanding the people and the systems in which you're designing for. It's something called human-centered design. And what he was saying was that he's starting to feel this kind of shift in the field away from human-centered design and towards behavioral economics as the strategy that people are beginning to rally around more and more. And so the reason that I wanted to start this session talking about this and the reason why I bring this up isn't to say pick a side or do this type of design or think about solving problems through this way. It's to convey what was really our concluding point, which is that great design incorporates a large number of methods and strategies. By its very nature, great design is driven by creating a certain type of experience for somebody, which should produce a positive benefit for whoever that person is that you're designing for. Oftentimes, the actual design is really the result of a cross-section of qualitative research, of prototyping, of stakeholder mapping, of behavioral economics, of all sorts of things. It isn't singular, and it's oftentimes, though the result might be simple, it's not the result of a very simple process. Which brings me to my real point as we get started with this lesson. Designing to increase the per gift amount that your donors are giving to you is not a starting from scratch kind of a proposition. There are people who spend an incredible amount of time in organizations of all types that spend an incredible amount of money studying how to design interactions in ways that produce better outcomes. So while designing for fundraising might seem in some essential way, different and unique than other design challenges, at its core, what we're really trying to do is we're just trying to successfully encourage people to give a little more to your organization. We're trying to find an outcome and impact the benefits of that outcome through designing an experience that's going to produce those results. Because the thing is, if there's one thing that this world knows about that it's incredibly good at, it's figuring out how to get people to part with their money, right? So we have ample material to draw from in terms of doing that for the purpose of donations. As just a starter, the way to think about designing for higher giving amounts is to think about the fact that we're guiding a behavior. But before we dig into the individual details, let's look at the different ways that we're going to discuss going about doing this, the different ways that you can actually use design to increase giving amounts. We'll talk about how to design hierarchies to make gifts feel smaller than they are in practice. We'll talk about structuring your giving amounts towards an obvious best choice, so you increase the likelihood that people give the amount that you're hoping they give. Then you'll see the value of breaking up big amounts into their smaller increments. And lastly, we're starting to see a slightly increasing amount of organizations using slider bars to encourage higher giving. And I want to walk you through the design thinking behind this option in case you're considering using one. The crux of all of these approaches is really, though, that giving frequency and giving amounts, they aren't necessarily predetermined. That with some really subtle but really smart design tweaks, you can actually increase the likelihood of people giving larger gifts to your organization. All right, so let's start getting into the nuts and bolts about how to do all of this. And to do that, we're going to start with a method that you can use that's extremely straightforward. So at some point, I'm sure you've had to think about the ordering of donation amounts that you put on a direct mail letter or even as they're laid out on a website, right? How do you start? Do you start with the lowest amount that you want? What size increments are you going to offer your gift options in? How many options should you offer? All of those types of things. It might be subtle. You might have not put any thought into it. They might be historically in place, or you might have had to do that, or you might have been asked to do that. I would love to hear how you thought through those decisions, what you used to help you decide which of those pieces should look how they do. Because while we'll go into some more info about how to think about the particular increments that you offer when we go through the next portion, one of the easiest things you can do is to simply order your predetermined giving amounts in descending amounts. So rather than start at $25 and moving up to $500, consider starting at the higher amount and moving down. What's happening subconsciously when you're going through amounts in this order is that that initial amount that you're seeing, that your donors are seeing, that they're experiencing, that number is absorbing some of the transitional shock that our brains go through when we have to start thinking about money. So you let the high amount shoulder that initial feeling. $500, we get sort of that resistance, we get that kind of discomfort that now we're looking at money, now we might be giving. And then you ease that up by showing a person lower and lower amounts. So you're reducing the stress and you're, in effect, increasing their comfort with giving. It might not be at that highest amount, but you're increasing the likelihood that they feel that comfort at a level that's higher than the lowest amount. So I'd recommend you should definitely test this with your own donor base. The result is often that people feel like the gifts they give, if they're ordered in this kind of descending way, that the gifts they give are more reasonable than had they initially faced the prospect of a big ask. In essence, the other gifts feel smaller in comparison. $50 after looking at $500 and $200 feels smaller than if you start at $5, $10, $25, and then go to $50. You know, this might not always work. Like I said, you should test it. Ideally, you could test it online first and see whether it does increase your giving amounts. But there's definitely a lot of evidence out there that says people respond really well to this kind of hierarchy, and that organizations can reap some really big returns if they do it in this way. So building on the ordering of giving amounts is also the challenge and the importance of setting the recommended giving amounts. Here's where organizations really often do a disservice to their institutions. In essence, they step out of the conversation. Here's what I mean by that. How many times have you seen or used donation amounts that simply increase by $25 and $50 increments like this? And then, maybe they jump up by a couple hundred. This is why fundraising can be so tricky, right? This sort of approach, these common increments, these common amounts, they're totally ubiquitous. Everybody uses them. And then you also face this related question, right? Is the fact that it's ubiquitous, is that enough of a justification for you to also use it to put your donors at some kind of ease and familiarity? I think these are really important questions, not only to ask, but to answer. And of course, the way you do that is by testing the various versions, right? But what I want you to think about is, and I'm going to be a little blunt with this, is just how lazy is it to toss up these kind of obvious increments and just hope for the best? It's kind of like the equivalent of a shoulder shrug. You're basically just saying, who knows? This will be fine. This is good enough. Let's just go with what we've been doing. But if you're trying to actually find ways to increase the amount your donors give to you in a significant way, then it's your responsibility to guide people towards giving certain amounts. Like I've been saying, our brains are hardwired for us to seek easy decisions. It's true. Our brains are constantly working, and in order to continue to have energy throughout the day, in order to continue to make decisions of whatever life throws at us all day, every day, we actually rely really heavily on others to guide our decisions. In a big kind of general way, that's the role of design, is to guide our actions and experiences and make them obvious and easy so they don't take too much brain power. Okay, so with that lens on, let's look at this again. The real takeaway is that this isn't guiding our decision-making process at all, right? It's just throwing out some options and making them all look equally worthy, and then just sitting back and leaving it entirely up to the donor to make a decision. In contrast, what smart design approaches do is they ease the decision-making process by encouraging a particular action. Look at this, for example. With color and framing and wording, our eyes are drawn immediately to the most popular giving amount. In almost every study about this kind of a thing, when you move from amounts that are designed to all look equally worthy to one of these designs that prioritizes the decision in a person's mind, the organization basically always sees a huge uptick in the highlighted option. I'm sure you remember this from political campaigns as well, right? When you have a politician or you have a candidate who says, our most popular donation amount is X dollars. Join the people supporting us by giving this amount, just like every other supporter. What they're doing with their words is the exact same thing that you can do with your designs. You tell people what the right decision is so they don't have to figure the answer out on their own. And to be totally honest, their overworked brains are actually going to appreciate if you do that for them. All right, so now we're going to look at the importance of breaking up larger gift options into smaller increments. I'm sure this is something you've come across before, right? Say you're signing up for a service and it says it's just $9.95 a month, but you end up being billed annually for it. So really what you're doing is you're buying something for $120 a year, but they're framing it in a way that feels less disruptive, feels less extreme. It seems more doable, while the other one seems like a huge ask. Nobody wants to look at $120 on their screen, but they're happy to look at $9.95 a month. That sounds like, and it feels like nothing. In essence, you're lowering the barrier to a person actually choosing that option. There's this whole thing where, a lot of times fundraising appeals are framed in an almost like desperate, please, do you have anything you can spare to help us kind of a way. When the reality is, you can actually raise a decent amount of money by framing your asks in a way that makes people feel more like they're just chipping in a little bit each month. And the great thing is that a lot of times you're going to be able to raise more money per person by framing your asks in this way than if you were to go after a bigger single one-time gift from each donor. So when you're thinking about using this approach, and again, like with all of them, I'd recommend testing the different approaches since there can be kind of conflicting evidence out there about what really matters and what really works. And what you want to do is figure out what works for your audience, for your organization's goals. But while you're thinking about doing this, you want to consider a couple of key things. First, what level of giving on a monthly basis is reasonable for your audience? So how low do you have to lower the threshold of a monthly giving amount to a point where it's likely that your audience would opt into that, and also that it's going to be beneficial financially for your organization? And then second, how can you frame your monthly ask so people choose this over a one-time gift? Third, what pricing structure works best? Are you going to use odd numbers? Are you going to use even numbers? Are you going to say $10? Or are you going to say $9.95 a month? You'll be surprised by how important these little decisions really are and how much they can really impact how much you end up raising. So the point of breaking down giving amounts into more approachable increments is really to put your faith in your organization's ability and your own ability to increase the lifetime value of a donor's commitment to you. In essence, you're making the ask feel small, but taken on the whole over time, you're confident that it's going to be more valuable to the organization. And generally speaking, the evidence definitely bears this out. The last design strategy for subtly increasing the amount of your donors' gifts upwards is to use a slider bar. And the reason why you want to consider using one of these, it doesn't really have anything to do with, the aesthetic appeal of a bar versus a button. One isn't prettier or, necessarily better. And done well, there's advantages either way. There's advantages to using a bar, there's advantages to really being smart about how you use buttons. I will say though that little interaction of moving the icon along the bar can be a really valuable little experience for your donors. Sometimes that sort of thing can be just enough to nudge people's giving amounts upwards. Really quickly though, before we kind of go into the details of this, I do want to just point out that one of the challenges in using a slider bar is that they tend to be a little more technologically complicated than if you just have predetermined donation amount buttons. And then of course, there's also the fact that you can't really build an offline version of this. You can't print a slider bar. So you have to think differently about how you would use, even if you're using it online, you'd have to think differently about how you're using it and how you're making your asks in paper form. These aren't really major issues, but they're worth considering, and I want to point those out initially. But with those things out of the way, let's get into the benefits of using slider bars. So let's take a look at this one for a second. I'm going to walk through a couple of the reasons why these can be such effective means of increasing gift amounts. One of the real values of donation slider bars is that the poles, the opposite ends of the bar that you're looking at, they have this extremely strong anchoring effect on our minds, especially since this is such a visual thing. For instance, if there are 6, say predetermined amounts listed on somebody's donation page, and they go from $25 up to $500, Many of us will just give how we always give. Sure, you could use the hierarchy, like I mentioned, to increase the likelihood people give bigger amounts, but in general, there is a sort of limitation to using just these predetermined amounts. The visual nature of numbers just listed out with buttons isn't particularly compelling, so we're driven pretty much solely by the amounts listed. But a slider bar is very different. It impacts our thought process to see that the dollar amount that we would maybe typically give, or that we would, initially sort of be drawn to, maybe that's the bare minimum lowest amount. Whether donors realize it or not, this actually causes this really kind of like internal discord that we set upon writing by pulling that slider bar over to the right at least a little bit. So we see our giving in a little bit better of a light. We actually physically move it so we feel better. And with the idea that deep down we're reconciling the discomfort of realizing how our donation looks on this bar. Again, this is incredibly powerful because you're creating a giving experience that encourages bigger gifts. You're in essence designing a more worthwhile, effective, and ultimately valuable giving program. By designing a better donor experience at the actual point of giving, you can give your organization more money to do the work that it does, to make the ultimate impact for the people that you're serving. Which brings us to the other real benefit of slider bars, and why that little interaction of pulling the icon back and forth can be so useful. The best uses of slider bars in conjunction with an organization's fundraising is that you tie the sliding levels of giving to sliding levels of impact. So not only are your donors compelled to give a little more by placing their donation at a place that visually makes them comfortable, but you also nudge them towards higher giving amounts by letting them see in real time how much more of an impact their slightly larger gift would make than a slightly lower one. This can be incredibly, incredibly powerful for increasing folks' giving amounts to you. So there you have them, 4 brilliant ways to use design to increase your donors' giving amounts. From hierarchy and recommended gift amounts to using incremental gift amounts and slider bars. You're really looking at 4 options that, in addition to being potentially really easy to implement, can also help you see some really tangible and impressive increases in your average gift amounts and the lifetime value of each of your donors.